The clock on the mantel struck midnight, and Duke Nathaniel Ashworth knew he had lost. He stood in the study of his late father's townhouse, a single candle burning low beside a stack of papers that could end everything he had ever known. Tomorrow, at noon, a court official would arrive to review the terms of his father's will. If Nathaniel was not married by then, the entire Ashworth estate, the land, the townhouse, the family name itself, would pass to his cousin, Lord Edmund Vale, a man who had spent years waiting for exactly this chance. Nathaniel had known about the deadline for months. He had courted 2 young ladies from respectable families, hoping to secure a quiet, sensible marriage before the date arrived. Both attempts had collapsed. One young lady's father demanded a dowry arrangement Nathaniel could not agree to on such short notice. The other simply refused him, unwilling to marry a man rumored to be losing his fortune. Word had spread quickly through the drawing rooms of the city. Nathaniel Ashworth was a duke in name only now, a man circling the edge of ruin. He pressed his palms against the edge of his desk and stared at the clock. 12 hours remained. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. He turned, expecting his butler, but instead found a young woman standing in the doorway with a coal scuttle in her hands. She wore a plain gray dress, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her dark hair pinned back in a simple knot. He recognized her only vaguely as one of the maids who worked in the lower part of the house, tending fires and carrying water long after the rest of the staff had gone to sleep. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said quickly, lowering her eyes. "I did not know you were still awake. I only came to see to the fire." "Wait," Nathaniel said before he understood why he had spoken at all. The maid froze in the doorway, clearly startled. She was young, perhaps 20, with a steady gaze that did not waver even as uncertainty crossed her face. "What is your name?" he asked. "Eliza, Your Grace. Eliza Hartley." He studied her for a long moment. An idea, sudden and reckless, began to take shape in his mind. It was not the kind of plan a sensible man would consider, but sensible plans had already failed him twice, and time was no longer a luxury he possessed. "Miss Hartley," he said, "I have a proposal for you. It may sound strange, and you are free to refuse it, but I ask that you hear it fully before you decide." Eliza's brow furrowed, but she nodded, setting the coal scuttle down carefully by the door. Nathaniel explained the situation as plainly as he could. He told her of his father's will, of the deadline closing in with the sunrise, of the cousin who stood ready to seize everything the moment the clock struck noon. He told her that he needed a wife, immediately, and that the marriage would be one of arrangement only, nothing more. In exchange, she would receive a title, a home, financial security, and protection from whatever hardships had brought her into service in his household in the first place. Eliza listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You want me to marry you," she said slowly. "A man I have spoken to perhaps twice in my life, before the sun rises tomorrow." "Yes." "And you expect nothing from me beyond the appearance of a marriage?" "Nothing beyond that." "You would have your own rooms, your own allowance, and my word that I would never treat you unkindly. In return, my cousin would have no claim to this house, and you would never again have to worry about debts or hunger or the fear of losing everything you have." Eliza's hands tightened at her sides. Nathaniel could see the calculation moving behind her eyes, the same kind of calculation he had been making all evening. She was not naive. She understood that this was not a romantic offer. It was a transaction, plain and simple, dressed in the language of desperation. "I have a younger brother," she said finally. "Daniel. He is 12. Our father passed 2 years ago and left us with debts I have been paying since, working here and taking in mending work at night. If I marry you, what becomes of him?" "He would want for nothing," Nathaniel said. "I give you my word." Something shifted in Eliza's expression. A flicker of hope quickly guarded behind caution. She had clearly expected refusal to be the safer answer, and yet the weight of her circumstances pressed against that caution. "Why me?" she asked. "There must be women of higher standing you could ask, even at this hour." "There is no time to ask anyone else," Nathaniel admitted. "And even if there were, I do not know that any of them would agree to a marriage built on nothing but necessity. You already work within these walls. You already know something of the household." It seemed, in this desperate hour, less impossible than any other option before me. Eliza was silent for a long time. The candle between them flickered, casting long shadows across the room. "If I agree," she said at last, "I want it in writing, my brother's future secured, my own protection guaranteed, regardless of what happens between us afterward." Nathaniel felt something close to relief loosen the tension in his chest. "I will have the papers drawn before dawn. Then I agree, Eliza said, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she had just accepted. There was no time for hesitation once the decision was made. Nathaniel sent for his solicitor, a bleary-eyed man roused from his bed who arrived within the hour, papers and ink in hand. A clergyman, an old family friend willing to overlook the unusual circumstances given the urgency, was summoned as well. By the time the first gray light of morning touched the windows, Eliza Hartley, a maid who had spent the evening tending fires in the lower halls, stood beside Nathaniel Ashworth in the townhouse chapel and became his wife. The ceremony was small and quiet, without music or celebration. Eliza wore a borrowed dress, hastily altered by one of the seamstresses among the staff. Her hands trembled slightly as she repeated her vows, though her voice never faltered. Nathaniel watched her throughout the brief ceremony, struck by how composed she remained even as the entire course of her life shifted beneath her feet. When it was finished, the clergyman offered his congratulations, though the words felt hollow in the quiet chapel. Nathaniel's solicitor gathered the signed papers and departed at once to ensure they would be ready for the court official's arrival at noon. Eliza stood alone in the chapel for a moment after the others had gone, staring down at the plain gold band now resting on her finger. Only hours ago, she had been carrying coal through the corridors of this house, invisible to most who passed her. Now she was a duchess, bound by law to a man she barely knew. Nathaniel approached her carefully, uncertain of what to say. "Are you well?" "I do not know what I am," Eliza said honestly. "I only know that my brother is safe now, and that matters more to me than anything else." By mid-morning, word of the sudden marriage had already begun slipping through the household staff, whispered from the kitchen to the stables to the servants' quarters. By the time the court official arrived precisely at noon, the marriage certificate was presented, signed and witnessed, leaving no room for challenge. Lord Edmund Vale, who had arrived at the townhouse expecting to claim victory, stood in the entrance hall reading the document with a expression that shifted from confusion to disbelief to barely restrained anger. "You married a maid," Edmund said, his voice low and sharp, "a servant from your own household. Do you truly believe society will accept this? Do you believe anyone will receive her?" "That is no longer your concern," Nathaniel replied evenly. "The terms of the will have been satisfied. The estate remains where it belongs." Edmund's gaze slid toward Eliza, who stood a few steps behind Nathaniel, her chin lifted despite the humiliation radiating from Edmund's stare. He studied her the way one might study an insect that had wandered somewhere it did not belong. "This is not finished," Edmund said quietly, before turning on his heel and departing without another word. The threat lingered in the air long after he had gone. Nathaniel watched the door close behind his cousin, aware that the danger to his family had not ended, only changed shape. Beside him, Eliza remained still, her composure intact though her eyes betrayed the exhaustion of a night that had upended everything she once understood about her own life. "You handled him well," Nathaniel said. "I have handled difficult people before," Eliza replied simply, "though never one quite so determined to see me fail." Nathaniel turned to face her fully for the first time since the ceremony had ended. "I know this is not the life you imagined for yourself. I will do everything within my power to make certain you do not regret the choice you made tonight." Eliza met his gaze, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "I made this choice for my brother, Your Grace. Whether I come to regret it or not, that decision remains the same." Later that afternoon, Nathaniel found Eliza standing near the window of what was now her own private sitting room, a space far grander than anything she had ever known. Fine curtains hung at the windows, and a soft carpet covered the floor beneath her feet, yet she stood with the same careful posture she had carried while working in the lower halls, as though she did not quite trust the comfort surrounding her. "You do not have to remain standing," Nathaniel said gently from the doorway. "This room belongs to you now." Eliza turned, a faint, tired smile touching her lips. "Forgive me. Old habits are not so easily set aside. There is no need to apologize for anything," he said. "Not to me, and not to anyone in this house." She glanced toward the window again, watching the carriages pass along the street below. "My brother does not yet know what has happened. I must send word to him before he hears it from someone else." "I will have a carriage sent for him this evening," Nathaniel offered. "He should not learn of this through rumor." Eliza's shoulders eased slightly at the offer, gratitude flickering across her face before she caught herself and straightened once more. "Thank you. That means more than you may realize." Nathaniel studied her for a moment, aware of how little he truly understood about the woman he had just married. He had acted out of desperation, yet standing before her now, he found himself curious about the life she had lived before tonight, the hardships that had shaped her quiet strength, and the resolve that had allowed her to accept such an impossible bargain without breaking. "We will find our way through this," he said, though he was uncertain whether the words were meant to reassure her or himself. Eliza nodded once, her gaze steady, despite everything the day had already asked of her. "We will have to," she said quietly, "because there is no path left to turn back." Outside, the city carried on as it always did, unaware that within these walls, an unlikely marriage had already begun reshaping the lives of two people who had never expected to meet each other, and that the desperate bargain struck in the darkest hour of the night would soon become something neither of them could have predicted. Eliza woke on her first morning as a duchess, to the sound of a maid drawing back the curtains, sunlight spilling across a bed far softer than any she had ever known. For a moment, she forgot where she was, her body still expecting the narrow cot in the servants' quarters and the cold floor beneath her feet. Then memory returned in a rush, and she sat up slowly, staring at the unfamiliar room around her. "Good morning, Your Grace," the maid said, dipping into a quick curtsy. Eliza recognized her at once. Hannah, a girl she had shared meals with only 2 days earlier, now stood before her with lowered eyes and careful formality, as though the friendship between them had been erased overnight. "Hannah, please," Eliza said softly. "You do not need to address me so stiffly." "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but I do," Hannah replied, not unkindly, though her voice carried a note of discomfort. "Things are different now." The words settled uneasily in Eliza's chest. She dressed with Hannah's assistance, the fine fabric of her new gown feeling foreign against her skin, and made her way downstairs to the breakfast room, uncertain of what awaited her there. Nathaniel was already seated at the long table, a newspaper open before him. He rose briefly as she entered, a formal gesture that felt strangely distant after the intimacy of the previous night's decisions. "I trust you slept well," he said. "Well enough," Eliza replied, taking her seat at the opposite end of the table. The distance between them felt vast, though only a length of polished wood separated their chairs. Breakfast passed mostly in silence. Nathaniel seemed absorbed in matters of business, occasionally murmuring instructions to a footman about correspondence that needed attention. Eliza ate quietly, aware of the housekeeper, Mrs. Whitfield, watching her from the doorway with an expression that gave nothing away. After breakfast, Mrs. Whitfield approached her in the hallway. "Your Grace, if you would permit me, there are matters of the household you may wish to review. Accounts, staff schedules, matters typically overseen by the lady of the house." Eliza hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Yes, I would like to see them." She spent the following hours in the small study reviewing ledgers and staff arrangements, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that the work came naturally to her. She understood the value of careful budgeting, having managed her own household's meager finances for years. She noticed inefficiencies in the kitchen accounts that had gone unaddressed, small waste that added up over months, and suggested changes with a confidence that seemed to catch Mrs. Whitfield off guard. "You have a sharp eye for this, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield admitted, studying the corrected figures. "I have had practice stretching very little into enough," Eliza replied simply. By late afternoon, Eliza ventured into the garden behind the townhouse, needing air after hours spent indoors. She had not expected to encounter anyone there, and was startled to find Nathaniel standing near the far hedge, seemingly lost in thought. "Forgive me," she said, beginning to turn back toward the house. "I did not mean to intrude." "You are not intruding," Nathaniel said. "This garden belongs to you as much as it does to me now." Eliza remained where she stood, uncertain whether to approach or retreat. Nathaniel gestured toward the bench nearby, an invitation rather than a command, and after a moment's hesitation, she crossed the grass and sat beside him, though a careful distance remained between them. "The staff seem uncertain how to treat me," she admitted, surprising herself with her own honesty. "Give them time," Nathaniel said. "This is new for everyone, myself included." "And what of society?" Eliza asked. "I heard the whispers this morning, even among the staff. They know what I was before yesterday." Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly. "Society will speak of many things, it always does. But you are my wife now, whatever its opinion may be." Eliza studied him carefully, searching for some deeper meaning behind the simple statement, but found only quiet resolve in his expression. "You barely know me," she said, "yet you defend me so readily." "I know enough," Nathaniel replied. "I know you agreed to an impossible bargain without hesitation, for the sake of your brother. I know you managed accounts today with more skill than most stewards I have employed. That tells me a great deal, even without years of acquaintance. A faint blush rose in Eliza's cheeks, unfamiliar and unwelcome in its intensity. She looked away toward the hedges, uncertain how to respond to words that felt warmer than anything their arrangement had promised. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the arrival of a footman announcing a visitor. Lady Charlotte Bellamy, a longtime friend of the Ashworth family, had come to call, having heard the astonishing news of the sudden marriage, and unable to resist confirming it for herself. Lady Charlotte swept into the drawing room with barely contained curiosity, her eyes moving over Eliza with open assessment. "So it is true," she said, settling onto the settee. "The whole city is speaking of nothing else." "Charlotte," Nathaniel said evenly, "this is my wife, Eliza." Lady Charlotte studied Eliza for a long moment, then, unexpectedly, offered a small, genuine smile. "Well, you certainly have caused quite a stir, my dear. Most women in this city spend years scheming for half the fortune you secured in a single evening." "I did not marry for fortune," Eliza said quietly, though firmly. Something shifted in Lady Charlotte's expression, curiosity giving way to something closer to respect. "No," she said slowly, "I do not believe you did. Interesting." The visit continued for nearly an hour, Lady Charlotte asking pointed questions that Eliza answered with careful honesty, never embellishing her circumstances nor apologizing for them. By the time Lady Charlotte departed, her earlier skepticism had softened considerably, replaced by open curiosity about the quiet, composed woman who had somehow captured the attention of one of the city's most eligible dukes. "She will speak of this visit to everyone she knows," Nathaniel said once the door had closed behind their guest. "Is that troubling?" Eliza asked. "Not necessarily," Nathaniel said. "Charlotte's opinion carries weight in certain circles. If she speaks favorably of you, it may soften some of the harsher judgments circulating already." Eliza absorbed this information quietly, aware of how quickly her worth in society's eyes had become tied to the opinions of strangers she had never met before yesterday. The weight of it pressed against her, though she refused to let it show. Over the following days, Eliza settled into a careful rhythm within the townhouse. She continued reviewing household accounts, earning quiet respect from Mrs. Whitfield and the staff who had once been her equals. She practiced the manners and customs expected of a duchess, studying with patient determination, refusing to let unfamiliarity become an excuse for failure. Nathaniel remained largely occupied with matters concerning the estate, their interactions polite but distant, though Eliza noticed small moments where his guard seemed to lower, brief exchanges over dinner where his usual reserve softened into something closer to genuine conversation. One evening, nearly a week after the wedding, Eliza found herself unable to sleep, her mind turning over the events that had reshaped her life so completely. She made her way quietly to the library, hoping to find a book that might ease her restless thoughts, and discovered Nathaniel already there, seated near the fireplace with a glass of brandy untouched beside him. "I did not expect company," he said, though he did not seem displeased by her presence. "I could not sleep," Eliza admitted, moving toward the shelves. "I did not mean to disturb you." "You are not disturbing me." He gestured toward the chair opposite his own. "Please, sit, if you wish." Eliza hesitated only briefly before accepting the invitation. The fire crackled softly between them, casting warm light across the room. "May I ask you something?" she said after a long silence. "Of course. Do you regret it? The bargain we made?" Nathaniel considered the question carefully before answering. "No," he said finally. "I do not. Though I confess I did not expect to find myself curious about my own wife so soon after marrying her out of necessity." Eliza's heart quickened at the admission, though she kept her expression carefully composed. "I did not expect to find myself curious about you either," she admitted quietly. They sat together for a long while after that, the conversation drifting into easier territory, questions about her childhood, about his father, about the small details of two lives that had collided so suddenly under circumstances neither of them had chosen. For the first time since the wedding, Eliza felt something other than fear or obligation settle in her chest, a fragile, uncertain warmth that she did not yet trust, but could not quite ignore either. 2 days after the wedding, a carriage arrived carrying Eliza's younger brother, Daniel, along with a small trunk containing everything he owned. Eliza met him at the entrance herself, unwilling to let anyone else deliver the news that had upended their lives so completely. Daniel stepped down from the carriage with wide eyes, staring up at the grand townhouse as though he had wandered into someone else's dream. "Eliza," he said slowly, "is it true?" "What the letter said?" "It is true," she confirmed, pulling him into a brief, tight embrace. "You are safe now, Daniel, truly safe." He studied her carefully, noticing the fine fabric of her gown, the pearls at her throat, details that had never belonged to the sister he had grown up with. "You married a duke," he said, disbelief still coloring his voice. "I did," Eliza said simply. "It is a long story, and I will explain everything. But first, come inside. You must be tired from the journey." Nathaniel greeted the boy warmly in the entrance hall, offering a handshake that seemed to steady Daniel's nerves considerably. "Welcome to your new home," Nathaniel said. "You will want for nothing here, and you will have tutors to continue your education properly." Daniel glanced toward his sister, silent gratitude passing between them that required no words. For the first time since the wedding, Eliza felt the full weight of relief settle over her, knowing that whatever uncertainty lay ahead, her brother's future was finally secure. That evening, as Daniel settled into his new room under Mrs. Whitfield's watchful supervision, Eliza found a quiet moment to thank Nathaniel properly. "You did not have to be so kind to him," she said. "The arrangement only required his safety, not his comfort." "He is your family," Nathaniel replied simply. "That makes him mine as well, whatever the terms of our arrangement may say." Eliza said nothing, though the words settled warmly in her chest, another small crack forming in the careful distance she had maintained since the wedding. Not everyone in the city greeted the news with such generosity of spirit. Across town, in a modest but well-appointed townhouse, Lord Edmund Vale sat with a glass of wine untouched before him, his expression dark as he reread the marriage certificate a solicitor had procured for him through less than honorable means. "A maid," he muttered to himself. "He married a common maid to spite me." His companion for the evening, a sharp-eyed young woman named Caroline Vane, sat across from him, listening with interest as he outlined his grievances. Caroline had once served briefly in the same household as Eliza before being dismissed under circumstances she preferred not to discuss, and she carried a quiet resentment toward her former colleague that made her a willing ally in Edmund's growing scheme. "I knew her," Caroline said, swirling her own glass of wine. "Eliza Hartley, quiet, always working, never causing trouble. It is almost amusing that such a dull creature has managed to secure a duke." "Amusing is not the word I would choose," Edmund said coldly. "That inheritance should belong to me. My uncle intended for the estate to remain within a proper bloodline, not to be handed over through some desperate, last-minute arrangement with a servant." "What do you intend to do?" Caroline asked. Edmund's fingers tightened around his glass. "The marriage cannot be undone easily, not with the papers already signed and witnessed. But reputation is a fragile thing, Caroline. If society comes to view this marriage as scandalous, embarrassing, an unforgivable stain upon the Ashworth name, Nathaniel may find himself forced to reconsider the arrangement entirely, or at the very least, weakened enough that I may find other means of reclaiming what should be mine." Caroline's lips curved into a slow smile. "And you believe I might be of some use in that endeavor?" "You know things about her past that others do not," Edmund said. "Debts, struggles, perhaps details she would prefer remain hidden from her new circle." "Perhaps I do," Caroline said, her tone carrying quiet satisfaction. "It would be my pleasure to help remind society exactly what Eliza Hartley truly is." Edmund raised his glass in a slow, deliberate toast. "To exposing the truth, then, however inconvenient it may prove for the new Duchess of Ashworth." Their plotting continued late into the evening. Details of an upcoming ball discussed in careful terms, an opportunity Edmund intended to use to plant the first seeds of doubt and scandal within society's watchful eyes. Neither of them noticed, nor cared, how deeply their scheme threatened to unravel a fragile happiness only just beginning to take root within the Ashworth household. Unaware of the danger gathering against her, Eliza spent the following days settling further into her new life. She continued managing household accounts, earning increasing respect from staff who had once doubted her, and spent quiet evenings in conversation with Nathaniel that grew steadily less formal, more genuine, each exchange chipping away at the careful walls they had both built around their unusual arrangement. Yet even as warmth grew quietly between them, a formal invitation arrived one morning, addressed to the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth, requesting their presence at a grand ball hosted by one of society's most prominent families. Eliza held the elegant card in her hands, unaware that the very event meant to introduce her properly to society had already become the battleground Edmund and Caroline intended to use against her. "You seem uneasy," Nathaniel observed, noticing the tension in her shoulders as she read the invitation. "I have never attended anything of this scale," Eliza admitted. "I do not wish to embarrass you." "You will not embarrass me," Nathaniel said firmly. You have handled every challenge placed before you since the moment we married. This will be no different." Eliza wanted desperately to believe him, though a quiet unease lingered in her chest, an instinct she could not quite name warning her that the ball ahead would test her composure in ways far more difficult than managing household ledgers or navigating polite conversation with a single curious visitor. Whatever waited for her within that grand ballroom, she resolved to face it as she had faced everything else in her life, without flinching and without apology for who she was. The ballroom shimmered with candlelight, hundreds of flames reflecting off crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. Yet Eliza felt as though every one of those lights had turned toward her the moment she stepped through the grand doors on Nathaniel's arm. Conversations paused. Fans lifted to hide whispered comments. Eyes followed her across the room with open curiosity, some merely intrigued, others openly hostile. Eliza kept her chin lifted and her expression composed, drawing on every lesson she had absorbed over the past week, though her heart pounded steadily beneath the elegant gown Mrs. Whitfield had helped her select for the evening. "Ignore them," Nathaniel murmured beside her, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "Their opinions matter far less than they believe." "Easy words for a man they have always accepted without question," Eliza replied softly, though there was no bitterness in her tone, only quiet observation. They moved through the crowd together, Nathaniel introducing her to acquaintances with steady confidence, though Eliza could sense the careful scrutiny behind every polite greeting extended her way. Some guests offered genuine warmth, curious about the woman who had captured a duke's attention under such unusual circumstances. Others offered only cold civility, their true feelings barely concealed beneath practiced smiles. Across the room, Lord Edmund Vale watched the arrival with quiet satisfaction, a glass of champagne resting untouched in his hand. Beside him, Caroline Vane surveyed the crowd with equal interest, waiting for the precise moment to set their plan into motion. "She carries herself well for a servant," Caroline observed, watching Eliza navigate the room with practiced grace. "Appearances mean little once the truth comes out," Edmund replied. "Give it time." The evening progressed through the usual rhythms of a grand society ball, music and dancing, quiet conversations conducted over refreshments, small gatherings forming and dissolving throughout the sprawling room. Eliza began, slowly, to relax, finding unexpected ease in conversation with Lady Charlotte, who had made a point of remaining close by, offering quiet guidance whenever unfamiliar customs threatened to trip Eliza's confidence. "You are doing beautifully," Charlotte whispered during a brief lull. "Better than most young ladies I have watched attempt their first grand ball, and they were raised for exactly this." "I feel as though everyone is waiting for me to make a mistake," Eliza admitted quietly. "Some are," Charlotte said honestly. "But do not give them the satisfaction of seeing it trouble you." It was during a pause between dances that Caroline made her move, approaching Eliza with a bright, deceptively friendly smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Eliza Hartley," Caroline said warmly, loud enough for several nearby guests to hear clearly. "How wonderful to see a familiar face. Though I suppose it is Duchess Ashworth now, is it not? Quite the change from carrying coal scuttles through servants' corridors." The words landed like a blow, deliberately cruel, deliberately public. Conversations nearby quieted as curious guests turned to listen more closely. Eliza felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she forced herself to remain composed, recognizing the trap laid carefully before her. "Miss Vane," Eliza said evenly, "I did not expect to see you here this evening." "Oh, I would not miss such an occasion," Caroline replied, her voice carrying easily across the small gathering that had formed around them. "It is not every day a common maid manages to secure a duke's hand through such convenient timing. Tell me, was it planned, or merely fortunate circumstance that placed you in his townhouse the very night his deadline arrived?" Whispers rippled through the surrounding guests, curiosity turning sharper, more pointed. Eliza felt Nathaniel stiffen beside her, ready to intervene, but she gently touched his arm, a silent request to allow her to answer for herself. "It was neither planned nor merely fortunate," Eliza said clearly, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "It was a decision made honestly, between two people facing difficult circumstances, and one I do not regret nor feel any need to justify to strangers, who know nothing of the truth behind it." "Strangers," Caroline repeated, feigning surprise. "How curious, considering we once worked in the very same household. Perhaps you have simply forgotten those days, now that silk and pearls have replaced your old uniform." "I have forgotten nothing," Eliza said firmly. "I remember every difficult day of hard work that brought me to where I stand tonight, and I carry no shame for any of it. If you intended this conversation to embarrass me, Miss Vane, I am afraid you have chosen the wrong target." A few soft murmurs of approval rippled through the surrounding crowd, guests clearly impressed by Eliza's composed response. Caroline's confident smile faltered slightly, clearly having expected tears, embarrassment, some visible crack in Eliza's resolve that she could exploit further. Sensing the shifting mood, Edmund stepped forward to salvage the moment, his tone smooth and deliberately cutting. "Come now, there is no need for such defensiveness, Duchess. We are simply curious how a maid manages such a remarkable transformation overnight. Surely, you understand why society finds the circumstances rather difficult to accept at face value." "I understand that circumstances born from desperation are rarely elegant," Eliza replied, meeting Edmund's gaze directly. "But I also understand that judging someone's worth purely by the work they once performed says far more about the character of the person judging than the person being judged." The words landed with quiet force, several guests exchanging surprised glances, clearly impressed by the unexpected sharpness beneath Eliza's composed exterior. Lady Charlotte, standing nearby, allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Edmund's expression darkened, clearly unprepared for such a firm response from someone he had expected to crumble easily under public scrutiny. "Careful, Duchess," he said quietly, his voice losing some of its earlier smoothness. "Society has long memories, and reputations, once damaged, are not so easily repaired." "Then it is fortunate," Nathaniel interjected, stepping forward at last, his voice carrying quiet authority that immediately drew the attention of everyone nearby, "that my wife has done nothing deserving of damage to her reputation. Unlike certain individuals in this room, who seem determined to manufacture scandal where none rightfully exists." The pointed remark, delivered with calm precision, shifted the crowd's attention sharply toward Edmund, whose composure faltered under the sudden weight of public scrutiny he had intended for Eliza alone. "I meant no offense," Edmund said stiffly, clearly recognizing the conversation had turned against him. "Of course not," Nathaniel replied, his tone carrying an edge sharp enough that few present missed the warning beneath it. Sensing the moment had passed beyond salvage, Caroline offered a tight, insincere smile before excusing herself, pulling Edmund away toward a quieter corner of the ballroom. The surrounding guests slowly dispersed as well, conversations resuming, though the atmosphere around Eliza had shifted noticeably, curiosity now tinged with genuine respect rather than mere judgment. "That was masterfully handled," Lady Charlotte said, once the immediate crowd had thinned, genuine admiration coloring her voice. "I do not believe I have ever seen Caroline Vane so thoroughly outmatched in conversation." Eliza released a slow, unsteady breath, the tension of the confrontation finally beginning to ease from her shoulders. "I did not expect to be tested so publicly, so soon." "You handled it exactly as it needed to be handled," Nathaniel said quietly, turning to face her fully, something warm and unmistakably proud reflected in his expression. "I underestimated how formidable my own wife could be." A faint, genuine smile finally broke through Eliza's carefully maintained composure. "I have had a great deal of practice defending myself, Your Grace. It seems the habit has proven useful even here." As the orchestra began a new set, Nathaniel extended his hand toward Eliza, an unspoken invitation that surprised her. "Would you dance with me?" Eliza hesitated, glancing around the crowded floor. "I have only practiced the steps a handful of times this past week. I cannot promise I will not embarrass us both." "I have watched you handle a room full of hostile strangers with more grace than most seasoned members of society manage in a lifetime," Nathaniel said, a faint smile touching his mouth. "I have no doubt you will manage a simple dance." She placed her hand in his, allowing him to lead her onto the floor as the music swelled around them. The steps came slowly at first, careful and measured, Eliza counting silently in her mind as Mrs. Whitfield had taught her. But with each turn, her movements grew steadier, more natural, guided by Nathaniel's patient, steady hand at her waist. "You are doing wonderfully," he murmured, as they turned together beneath the glittering chandeliers. "I believe that has more to do with my partner than my own skill," Eliza replied, a genuine smile finally breaking through the careful composure she had maintained since arriving. For a few precious minutes, the weight of the evening's earlier confrontation faded, replaced by something lighter, something that felt, for the first time since their hurried wedding, almost like the beginning of an ordinary courtship rather than a desperate arrangement born from necessity. Eliza found herself watching Nathaniel's face as they moved together, noticing details she had not allowed herself to consider before, the quiet warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, the small, genuine smile that seemed reserved only for these unguarded moments. When the dance ended, Nathaniel did not immediately release her hand, holding it a moment longer than propriety strictly required. "Thank you," he said quietly. For what? For agreeing to dance with a man who has given you very little reason to trust him beyond a hurried promise made in desperation. Eliza studied him carefully, surprised by the vulnerability in his admission. You have given me more reason to trust you than you realize, Your Grace. Tonight especially. Their quiet exchange was interrupted by the approach of an elderly gentleman, Lord Pemberton, an old friend of Nathaniel's late father, who greeted them both with genuine warmth entirely absent from many of the earlier introductions Eliza had endured that evening. Ashworth, Lord Pemberton said, clasping Nathaniel's hand firmly, and this must be your new Duchess. I must say, my dear, I overheard a portion of your exchange with young Miss Vane earlier this evening, handled with far more grace than I would have managed at your age, I dare say. Thank you, my lord, Eliza said, warmth spreading through her chest at the unexpected kindness. Your father would have been proud to see this household continue with such quiet strength at its center, Lord Pemberton added, turning to Nathaniel with genuine affection in his weathered expression. Whatever the circumstances of your marriage, I see wisdom in the choice, my boy. The remainder of the evening passed with considerably less tension, guests approaching Eliza with growing curiosity, and, in several cases, genuine warmth, clearly impressed by the quiet strength she had demonstrated under such deliberate public pressure. Even those who had arrived skeptical of the sudden marriage found themselves reconsidering their earlier judgments, murmured conversations shifting gradually from scandal toward grudging admiration. Across the room, watching the shift in public sentiment with growing frustration, Edmund pulled Caroline aside, his earlier confidence replaced by simmering anger. That did not go as planned, Caroline said quietly. No, Edmund agreed, his jaw tight. It did not. She is more resilient than I anticipated, and Nathaniel more protective of her than I expected as well. What now? Caroline asked. Edmund's eyes narrowed, calculation replacing his earlier frustration. Public embarrassment alone will not be enough to unravel this marriage, it seems. We will need something more substantial, something that cannot be answered with clever words and composed defiance. Such as? Give me time to think, Edmund said, his voice low and deliberate. There are other ways to weaken a household beyond mere reputation. Financial vulnerabilities, perhaps. Every estate has weaknesses, if one knows precisely where to look. You believe you can find something within the Ashworth accounts? Caroline asked, intrigued. My uncle left the estate in reasonable order, but Nathaniel has been distracted these past months, first with courting suitable brides, and now with this absurd marriage, Edmund said. A distracted man rarely watches his ledgers as closely as he should. And a new duchess, unfamiliar with the true scope of managing such a large household, may prove an easy figure to implicate should discrepancies happen to appear where none previously existed. Caroline's eyebrows lifted with interest. You intend to manufacture evidence against her? I intend to create doubt, Edmund corrected smoothly. Doubt is far more effective than outright accusation. If whispers begin circulating that funds have gone missing since the new Duchess assumed control of household matters, suspicion will follow naturally, regardless of the truth. Nathaniel's trust in her is still young. It would not take much to plant seeds capable of growing into genuine conflict between them. And if he defends her regardless, as he did tonight, then we shall need to ensure the evidence is convincing enough that even loyalty cannot withstand it, Edmund said, his voice cold and certain. I have connections within the banking houses who owe me favors. It would not be difficult to arrange discrepancies within certain transaction records, subtle enough to avoid immediate detection, but damaging enough to raise serious questions once discovered. Caroline studied him for a long moment, clearly impressed despite herself by the careful cruelty of his plan. You have thought this through rather thoroughly for a scheme conceived only this evening. I have thought of little else since the moment I learned of their absurd marriage, Edmund admitted. That inheritance belongs to me, Caroline. I will not allow a maid and her convenient timing to strip away what should rightfully be mine. Caroline's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. Then perhaps it is time we looked more carefully. Unaware of the darker scheme now taking shape against them, Nathaniel and Eliza departed the ball together as the evening drew to its close, walking side by side toward their waiting carriage. The city night stretched quiet and cool around them, a welcome contrast to the tense brightness of the ballroom they had left behind. Thank you, Eliza said softly, as the carriage pulled away from the grand townhouse, for standing beside me tonight, even when I did not need rescuing. I did not stand beside you out of obligation, Nathaniel replied, his gaze steady in the dim carriage light. I stood beside you because watching you face that entire room with such quiet strength reminded me exactly why this arrangement, however it began, feels less and less like mere convenience with each passing day. Eliza's breath caught slightly at the unexpected honesty in his words, warmth spreading through her chest, despite the exhaustion of the evening's confrontations. She said nothing in response, uncertain of how to voice the quiet, unfamiliar hope beginning to take root within her. But she allowed her hand to rest gently near his on the carriage seat between them, a small, wordless acknowledgement of the shifting bond growing steadily stronger between two people who had begun this journey as strangers bound only by desperate necessity. When they arrived home, Nathaniel walked Eliza to the door of her chambers, the hallway quiet around them save for the soft glow of a single lamp left burning by the attentive staff. "You should rest," he said. "Tonight asked a great deal of you." "I do not think I could sleep just yet," Eliza admitted. "My mind is still turning over everything that happened." "Then perhaps you will allow me to sit with you a while longer," Nathaniel offered, if only to keep the quiet company. Eliza smiled, the exhaustion of the evening softened by the warmth of his offer. "I would like that." They settled into the small sitting room adjoining her chambers, speaking quietly of small, unimportant things. The sound of Daniel's laughter still faintly audible, somewhere down the hall where he had stayed up later than he should have, delighted by his new surroundings. For the first time since the desperate bargain that had bound them together, Eliza allowed herself to imagine a future built on more than mere necessity, though she remained careful not to voice such fragile hope aloud, unwilling yet to trust a happiness that felt almost too sudden to be real. Neither of them noticed, as the night settled quietly around the townhouse, the watchful eyes that had followed their departure from a distance, nor could they have guessed how quickly the danger gathering against them would arrive, threatening to test the fragile trust they had only just begun to build. 3 weeks after the ball, Mrs. Whitfield entered the study with an expression Eliza had never seen on her before, pale and visibly shaken, a ledger clutched tightly against her chest. "Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield said, her voice unsteady, "I believe there is a serious problem with the household accounts." Eliza set down her pen immediately, alarm rising in her chest. "What kind of problem?" Mrs. Whitfield placed the ledger on the desk, her hands trembling slightly as she turned to a marked page. "A significant sum has gone missing from the estate's accounts, transferred through channels I do not recognize. The transaction bears your signature, Your Grace, though I confess I do not understand how such a thing could have occurred without my knowledge." Eliza stared down at the page, confusion quickly turning to cold dread. The signature beside the transaction did resemble her own handwriting, close enough that a casual glance would offer no doubt. Yet she had never authorized any such transfer, had never even seen the document before this moment. "I did not sign this," Eliza said firmly, though panic edged into her voice despite her effort to remain composed. "I have never seen this transaction before in my life." "I believe you," Mrs. Whitfield said quickly, though worry remained etched across her features. "But I fear others may not be so quick to extend the same trust, particularly given the circumstances surrounding your recent marriage." The weight of those words settled heavily over Eliza. She understood immediately the danger such a discovery represented, not merely to her reputation, but to the fragile trust she had spent weeks carefully building with Nathaniel and the household staff who had gradually come to accept her. "We must tell the Duke immediately," Eliza said, rising from her chair despite the unsteadiness in her legs. Nathaniel's reaction, when he examined the ledger himself, was more restrained than Eliza had feared, though a shadow of uncertainty crossed his expression as he studied the forged signature closely. "This does look remarkably similar to your handwriting," he said slowly, his tone carefully neutral. "I did not sign this, Nathaniel," Eliza said, using his given name for the first time, desperation slipping into her voice despite her effort to remain calm. "I would never do such a thing." "I want to believe you," Nathaniel said, though the hesitation in his voice cut deeper than Eliza had expected. "But you must understand how this appears. A significant sum has vanished, bearing your signature, only weeks after you assumed control of these accounts. Do you truly believe I would steal from this household?" Eliza asked, hurt bleeding through her carefully maintained composure. "After everything I have done to prove myself worthy of this position, after everything my brother's safety depends upon." Nathaniel rubbed a hand across his face, clearly torn between the evidence before him and the trust he had begun building with his wife over the past weeks. "I do not know what to believe, Eliza. I want to trust you completely, but the evidence is troubling, and I cannot simply dismiss it without proper investigation." The careful warmth that had grown steadily between them over recent weeks seemed to crack under the weight of his hesitation. Eliza felt a familiar, painful isolation settle over her, the same isolation she had known throughout years of hardship before their marriage, the sense that no matter how hard she worked, how honestly she conducted herself, suspicion would always find its way to her door eventually. "Investigate then," Eliza said, her voice quiet but firm, masking the hurt threatening to overwhelm her. "I have nothing to hide, and I would rather the truth come out clearly than live beneath a cloud of doubt you cannot fully set aside." Over the following days, tension settled heavily over the household. Nathaniel launched a discreet investigation into the household accounts, questioning staff members and reviewing transaction records with growing frustration, as no clear explanation immediately emerged. Eliza continued her daily responsibilities with outward composure, though the distance that had reopened between herself and Nathaniel weighed on her heavily, each quiet dinner together carrying an unspoken strain neither of them addressed directly. Daniel noticed the shift immediately, his young eyes perceptive despite his age. "Is something wrong between you and the Duke?" he asked one evening as Eliza tucked him into bed, a habit she had maintained despite her new responsibilities. "There is a misunderstanding we are working through," Eliza said carefully, unwilling to burden her brother with the full weight of her worries. "Will it be all right?" Daniel asked, uncertainty coloring his young voice. "I hope so," Eliza said honestly, smoothing his blanket with practiced tenderness. "I truly hope so." Alone that evening, Eliza sat in her sitting room, staring at the flickering candle beside her, exhaustion and hurt pressing heavily against her chest. She thought of the desperate bargain that had brought her into this life, the careful trust she had built brick by brick over recent weeks, and how quickly it had all threatened to collapse beneath a single forged signature she had no way to immediately disprove. For the first time since her wedding, Eliza allowed herself to consider leaving. She had entered this marriage for her brother's safety, and that safety, at least, seemed secure regardless of what happened between herself and Nathaniel. Perhaps it would be easier, she thought, to remove herself from a household where suspicion could take root so easily, rather than continue fighting to prove her worth to people who might never fully trust her. Yet even as the thought formed, something within her resisted it. She had never been the sort of person to retreat from a fight, however painful, and abandoning her position now would feel like conceding to Edmund and whatever scheme he had surely orchestrated to bring them to this point. There had been one night, in the depths of that difficult week, when Eliza had gone so far as to pack a small trunk, folding her few plain dresses from before the marriage, neatly atop the finer gowns she had since acquired, uncertain which life truly belonged to her anymore. She had sat on the edge of her bed for a long while, staring at the trunk, imagining a quiet departure before dawn, a return to whatever modest lodgings her remaining wages might secure, sparing herself the slow humiliation of watching trust crumble day by day. But then she had thought of Daniel, sleeping peacefully down the hall in a room with a proper fire and a full stomach for the first time in years, and she had thought, too, of her own reflection in the mirror, a woman who had never once run from hardship, however unfair. Slipping away in the night would mean allowing Edmund's scheme, whatever its true shape, to succeed entirely unchallenged. It would mean proving nothing except that suspicion alone was enough to break her. She had unpacked the trunk before sunrise, refolding each garment with steady hands, and resolved instead to fight for the truth rather than flee from doubt. It was that same resolve that carried her into the study each night afterward, determined to uncover the truth herself rather than wait passively for Nathaniel's investigation to conclude, staying awake long into the night studying transaction dates, comparing handwriting samples, searching for any detail that might reveal how the forged signature had come to exist. 3 nights into her private investigation, she discovered something Mrs. Whitfield's initial review had overlooked. The forged transaction had been processed through a specific banking clerk, a name she did not recognize among the household's usual financial contacts. Further investigation revealed that this same clerk had processed several other transactions in recent months, all connected, however loosely, to accounts associated with Lord Edmund Vale. Eliza's pulse quickened as the pieces began fitting together. She gathered the relevant documents carefully, organizing them into a clear, methodical presentation of evidence, determined to bring undeniable proof before Nathaniel, rather than relying solely on his trust in her word. She found him in his study late the following evening, still awake, poring over the same ledgers that had caused such damage to the fragile trust between them. "I have found something," Eliza said, placing her gathered documents on the desk before him. "I believe I know how this forgery occurred, and who is truly responsible." Nathaniel studied the documents carefully, as Eliza explained her findings, walking him through each connection she had uncovered, the banking clerk's unusual involvement, the pattern of transactions linking back toward Edmund's known associates. As the evidence mounted before him, Nathaniel's expression shifted from cautious skepticism to dawning recognition, and finally, to something closer to shame. "Eliza," he said slowly, setting down the papers, "I owe you a sincere apology. I allowed doubt to cloud my judgment when I should have trusted you completely." "You had reason for caution," Eliza said, though the hurt of the past days remained evident in her voice. "The evidence against me was convincing, and you have a household, a legacy to protect." "That does not excuse the way I treated you," Nathaniel said firmly, rising from his chair to stand before her. "You have done nothing but prove your integrity since the moment we married, and I allowed a single forged document to undermine the trust you rightfully earned. I am truly sorry, Eliza. I should have believed you from the very beginning." Eliza studied him carefully, searching his expression for sincerity, and found only genuine remorse reflected there. Slowly, the tension that had gripped her chest for days began to ease, though the memory of his earlier hesitation lingered, a reminder of how fragile trust could prove under sufficient pressure. "We must confirm this evidence properly before confronting anyone," Eliza said, steering the conversation toward practical matters, unwilling yet to fully address the emotional wound his doubt had left behind. "If Edmund truly orchestrated this scheme, we will need undeniable proof before any public accusation." "Agreed," Nathaniel said. "I will have my solicitor examine everything you have gathered immediately. This clerk you identified may prove willing to speak the truth if approached correctly, particularly if he understands the serious consequences of continued involvement in such a scheme." The following morning, Nathaniel and his solicitor called upon the banking clerk directly, a nervous young man named Harold Finch, who worked in a modest office not far from the financial district. Confronted with the documents Eliza had assembled, Harold's composure crumbled almost immediately, his hands trembling as he realized the seriousness of what had been discovered. "I meant no true harm," Harold insisted, his voice shaking. "Lord Vale offered payment I could not easily refuse. He said the funds would be quietly restored before anyone noticed the discrepancy, that it was merely a private matter between family members, nothing that would cause lasting trouble." "You forged my wife's signature on a legal transaction," Nathaniel said coldly. "That is far from a private family matter, Mr. Finch. That is a crime, and one that could see you facing serious consequences unless you cooperate fully with what I require of you now." Pale and visibly frightened, Harold agreed at once to provide a full written confession detailing Edmund's involvement, along with copies of correspondence proving the arrangement between them. It was far more evidence than Nathaniel had hoped to secure so quickly, sufficient not merely to clear Eliza's name privately, but to expose Edmund's scheme publicly should the need arise. When Nathaniel returned home that evening and shared the confession with Eliza, relief washed visibly over her features, though it was tempered by quiet anger at how close the scheme had come to succeeding. "He was willing to see me ruined, my reputation destroyed, simply to reclaim an inheritance he was never rightfully owed," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. "He underestimated you," Nathaniel said quietly. "As, I confess, I very nearly did myself. In a moment of weakness I deeply regret." Eliza met his gaze, the earlier hurt still present but softened now by the evidence of his genuine remorse and the tireless effort he had shown in helping uncover the truth once doubt had finally given way to belief. "We will address that regret properly, in time," she said. "For now we must decide what to do with what we have learned." As they worked together late into the night, carefully building their case against the true culprits behind the forged transaction, Eliza felt something shift once again between them. Not quite the easy warmth of recent weeks, but something steadier, forged through the difficulty of the past several days, a partnership tested and, however imperfectly, beginning to heal. That night, before retiring, Nathaniel walked Eliza once more to her chambers, though the distance between them had narrowed considerably since the confession had come to light. "I meant what I said," he told her quietly at her door. "I should have trusted you from the beginning, without hesitation. It will not happen again." "I want to believe that," Eliza said honestly, "and I am willing to try, if you are willing to prove it, not only in words, but in how you treat the next difficulty that finds its way to our door." "I intend to," Nathaniel said, "starting with how we handle Edmund. He must answer for what he has done, publicly, so that no lingering doubt remains among those who witnessed the scandal he tried so hard to create." Eliza nodded slowly, a flicker of quiet determination returning to her expression despite the lingering weariness of the past difficult days. "Then let us make certain he cannot hide behind excuses when the truth is finally laid before him." Yet even as their investigation gathered momentum and their fragile trust began steadily mending, Eliza could not fully shake the quiet ache of having been doubted so readily. nor the awareness that whatever Edmund and Caroline intended next, the battle for her place within this household, and within Nathaniel's trust, was far from finished. The invitation arrived within days, another grand gathering hosted by Lord Pemberton, who, unaware of the full scope of Edmund's scheming, had extended the same courtesy to both Nathaniel's household and Edmund's. Nathaniel recognized immediately the opportunity such an event presented, a chance to confront Edmund publicly, before the very society he had attempted to turn against Eliza. "Are you certain this is the right approach?" Eliza asked as they prepared for the evening, Mrs. Whitfield fastening the final clasps of her gown. "A public confrontation carries risk. If anything goes wrong, the scandal could prove worse than what Edmund originally intended. The evidence is undeniable," Nathaniel assured her. "Harold's confession, the correspondence linking Edmund directly to the scheme, the transaction records themselves. This is not a risk built on assumption, it is a certainty built on proof." Eliza studied her reflection in the mirror, steadying her nerves with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through every difficult moment since her wedding. "Then let us finish what he started." Before departing for the evening, Nathaniel had spent the better part of the afternoon meeting privately with his solicitor and 2 respected members of the local magistrate's office, ensuring that the evidence against Edmund would hold firm against any attempt at denial. He returned home just as the sun began sinking low over the city, finding Eliza in the small sitting room where Daniel sat beside her, practicing his letters under her patient guidance. "Everything is prepared," Nathaniel said, watching the 2 of them for a moment, before either noticed his presence. "The magistrate's office has reviewed the confession and the correspondence. They agree there is more than sufficient grounds to bring formal charges, should we choose to pursue them, once tonight's confrontation has run its course." Daniel looked up from his slate, curiosity plain on his young face. "Are you going to make him pay for what he did to Eliza?" "We are going to make certain the truth is known," Nathaniel said gently, crouching slightly to meet the boy's eyes. "Sometimes that matters more than punishment alone." Eliza set aside her own quiet worry long enough to smile at the exchange, grateful for the ease with which Nathaniel had folded her brother into their small, unconventional family. Once Daniel had been settled for the evening under Mrs. Whitfield's care, Eliza returned to her chambers to dress, her thoughts turning over the confrontation soon to come. "You seem far away," Nathaniel observed, finding her seated quietly before her mirror as Hannah finished arranging her hair. "I am thinking of everything that has happened since that first night," Eliza admitted. "It feels strange, standing here now, preparing to face the very man who tried so hard to see me ruined, and finding that I am no longer afraid of him." "You have earned that lack of fear," Nathaniel said. "Every difficult day since our wedding has proven exactly the kind of strength Edmund never accounted for when he began his scheme." Eliza met his gaze in the mirror's reflection, something steady and resolved settling over her features. "Then let us finish it properly." The gathering that evening rivaled the previous ball in scale, though the atmosphere carried a different weight entirely. Charged with anticipation neither Eliza nor Nathaniel could fully mask despite their outward composure. They arrived deliberately later than most guests, allowing the room to fill completely before making their entrance, ensuring the widest possible audience for the confrontation soon to unfold. Edmund stood near the refreshment table when they entered, Caroline beside him, both clearly startled by the sight of Nathaniel and Eliza arriving with such evident confidence, a stark contrast to the uncertain, guarded tension that had marked their appearance at the previous gathering. "Ashworth," Edmund said, forcing casual pleasantness into his greeting as Nathaniel approached directly, Eliza at his side. "I did not expect to see you here this evening, given the recent difficulties within your household." "Difficulties that have since been thoroughly resolved," Nathaniel replied evenly, his voice carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of several nearby guests. "Though I confess, resolving them revealed information I believe deserves a wider audience." Edmund's expression flickered, uncertainty briefly crossing his carefully composed features. "I am not certain what you mean." "Then allow me to clarify," Nathaniel said, withdrawing a folded document from within his coat, the very confession Harold Finch had provided days earlier. "It seems a certain banking clerk was persuaded, through generous payment, to forge my wife's signature on a fraudulent transaction, intended to cast suspicion upon her honesty, and, presumably, weaken this marriage sufficiently that you might find opportunity to reclaim an inheritance the courts have already settled." A ripple of murmurs spread through the nearby guests, curiosity turning quickly toward alarm as the implications of Nathaniel's words settled over the gathering crowd. Edmund's composure cracked visibly, color draining from his face as several guests turned to study him with open suspicion. "This is a serious accusation," Edmund said, attempting to recover his footing, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. You have no proof beyond the word of some minor clerk desperate to shift blame away from himself. I have his full written confession, Nathaniel said calmly, along with correspondence bearing your own handwriting, discussing payment for services rendered in considerable detail. I have already shared copies with the appropriate authorities, should you wish to challenge their authenticity through proper legal channels. Edmund's jaw tightened, panic flickering briefly beneath his carefully maintained composure. Beside him, Caroline had gone noticeably pale, edging subtly away as though attempting to distance herself from the unfolding scandal before it could fully attach itself to her own reputation. You would ruin your own cousin standing over a maid, Edmund said, desperation sharpening his voice as the surrounding crowd continued to grow, whispers spreading rapidly through the ballroom as more guests became aware of the confrontation unfolding. My wife, Nathaniel corrected firmly, has done nothing except endure every scheme you have thrown against her, with more grace and integrity than you have shown throughout this entire affair. You forged documents, bribed a vulnerable clerk, and attempted to destroy an innocent woman's reputation, all in pursuit of an inheritance that was never rightfully yours to claim. I am not ruining your standing, Edmund. You accomplished that entirely on your own. Eliza stepped forward then, unwilling to remain silent while Nathaniel defended her alone, her voice steady and clear, despite the weight of every eye now fixed upon them both. I understand the difficulty of watching something you believed belonged to you slip beyond your reach, Lord Vale. I have known hardship, and I have known the desperation that difficult circumstances can inspire, but desperation does not excuse cruelty, nor does it excuse attempting to destroy another person's life simply because your own ambitions were disappointed. The ballroom had fallen almost entirely silent now, guests watching the confrontation with rapt, unguarded attention, several exchanging quiet glances that carried unmistakable judgment directed squarely at Edmund. You know nothing of true hardship, Edmund spat, his composure fully abandoned now, anger and humiliation twisting his features into something far less controlled than the calculated cruelty he had displayed at the previous ball. You were a maid, carrying coal through servants' corridors, and now you dare stand here and lecture me on morality? I dare, Eliza said evenly, because unlike you, I never once attempted to destroy another person's life to improve my own circumstances. I worked. I endured hardship honestly. And when opportunity finally arrived, however unusual its form, I did not use it as a weapon against anyone else. A murmur of approval rippled through the surrounding guests, several offering quiet nods of agreement, clearly moved by the quiet dignity in Eliza's response. Caroline, sensing the tide turning irreversibly against them, attempted a final, desperate defense of her own involvement. I only repeated what others already knew, she said quickly, her voice pitched to Carrie, though it trembled with obvious panic. I never forged anything myself. Whatever Lord Vale arranged with that clerk had nothing to do with me. You knew of the scheme from its very beginning, Nathaniel said coldly, turning his attention toward her without hesitation. Harold Finch's confession names you directly, Miss Vane, as the one who first suggested exploiting old grievances from your time in this household to damage my wife's reputation. Whether or not you personally forged the document, you were eager enough to see it succeed. Caroline's face drained of what little color remained, the surrounding guests now regarding her with the same open disapproval they had already turned upon Edmund. Whatever social standing she had once carried within these circles seemed to dissolve visibly under the weight of collective judgment. Lord Pemberton himself stepped forward from the gathered crowd, his expression grave as he addressed Edmund directly. I have known your family for many years, Edmund, Lord Pemberton said, his voice carrying easily across the now hushed ballroom. Your uncle would be deeply ashamed to witness the lengths you have gone to reclaim what the law has already rightfully settled. I suggest you leave quietly, before this evening's revelations invite consequences beyond mere public embarrassment. Edmund glanced around the ballroom, taking in the sea of disapproving faces surrounding him, the whispered judgments he could no longer ignore or dismiss. Whatever remained of his earlier confidence collapsed entirely under the weight of such thorough public humiliation. This is not finished, Edmund muttered, though the threat carried little conviction now, more a desperate attempt to preserve some fragment of dignity. As he turned to leave the ballroom, Caroline following hastily behind him, equally eager to escape the scrutiny now fixed so firmly upon them both. As the doors closed behind their retreating figures, the ballroom slowly returned to its usual rhythm, though conversations continued buzzing with the events that had just unfolded. Several guests approached Eliza directly, offering genuine words of support and admiration for the composure she had shown throughout the entire ordeal, a stark contrast to the skeptical curiosity that had greeted her at the previous gathering. "You handled that remarkably well," Lady Charlotte said, appearing at Eliza's side once the immediate crowd had begun to disperse. "I do not believe Edmund Vale will show his face in respectable society again for quite some time." "I take no pleasure in his humiliation," Eliza admitted quietly, "though I cannot deny the relief of finally having this matter settled openly, rather than lingering as a quiet threat over everything we have built." "There is no shame in feeling relief," Lady Charlotte said kindly. "You spent weeks carrying the weight of an accusation you never deserved. Anyone in your position would welcome seeing it lifted so completely, and so publicly." Nearby, Lord Pemberton approached once more, offering a respectful bow toward Eliza that surprised her with its formality. "Duchess Ashworth, I hope you will forgive an old man's earlier hesitation regarding your marriage. I confess I harbored some doubts when I first heard the news, wondering whether Nathaniel had acted too hastily in such difficult circumstances. Watching you tonight, I find those doubts entirely unfounded. Your late father-in-law would have been proud to call you family." "Thank you, my lord," Eliza said, warmth spreading through her chest at the unexpected kindness, so different from the cold scrutiny that had greeted her at the very first gathering weeks earlier. "That means a great deal to me." As the evening wore on, an unmistakable shift settled over the ballroom. Guests who had once regarded Eliza with cautious curiosity, now approaching her with open warmth and genuine interest, several openly praising the composure and dignity she had displayed throughout the confrontation. What had begun as a scandal engineered to destroy her standing had instead cemented her place within society more firmly than any conventional courtship ever could have managed. Nathaniel turned to face her fully, something deep and unmistakable reflected in his expression as the last of the immediate crowd moved away, granting them a rare moment of relative privacy within the still bustling ballroom. "You did not need my defense tonight," he said quietly. "You handled him entirely on your own strength." "We handled him together," Eliza corrected gently, "as we have handled everything since this began." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, something warm and openly admiring softening his usual composed expression. "I believe I owe you more than an apology for my earlier doubt, Eliza. I believe I owe you an honest admission." Eliza's breath caught slightly at the sudden shift in his tone, uncertain what he intended to say, though a fragile hope stirred quietly beneath her composed exterior. "What admission?" "That what began as a desperate arrangement, born purely from necessity, has become something I never expected to find within it," Nathaniel said, his voice low and sincere, meant only for her ears despite the surrounding crowd. "I did not marry you for love, Eliza. I married you out of desperation, believing our arrangement would remain nothing more than a practical solution to an impossible circumstance. But watching you tonight, watching you face every hardship this marriage has brought with such quiet, unshakable strength, I find myself no longer able to deny what has grown steadily within me since that very first night." Eliza's heart pounded steadily in her chest, uncertain hope warring against the careful guard she had maintained since the painful days of Nathaniel's earlier doubt. "And what exactly has grown within you, Your Grace?" A faint, genuine smile touched Nathaniel's lips, warmth replacing the careful composure he had maintained throughout the tense confrontation moments earlier. "Something I believe closely resembles love, though I confess I have little experience recognizing it clearly enough to name it with complete certainty." The words settled over Eliza with quiet, overwhelming force, though the memory of his earlier hesitation, the painful days when doubt had nearly unraveled everything they had built together, held her back from immediate, unguarded acceptance of his admission. "I want to believe you," Eliza said honestly, her voice softer now, vulnerability slipping through the careful composure she had maintained throughout the evening's difficult events. "But trust, once shaken, does not mend so easily, Nathaniel. I need more than words spoken in the warmth of a moment such as this." "Then I will prove it," Nathaniel said firmly, "not through words alone, but through every day that follows, until you no longer have reason to doubt where my loyalty and my heart truly belong." Eliza studied him carefully, searching his expression for any hint of the same performative charm Edmund had displayed so convincingly, before revealing his true nature, but found only sincere, quiet determination reflected in Nathaniel's steady gaze. Whatever uncertainty remained within her, she recognized, with quiet surprise, that some fragile part of her heart wished desperately to believe him.
"Then prove it,"
she said softly, "and we shall see, together, what this arrangement truly becomes." He reached for her hand then, not with the formal courtesy he had shown her throughout their earliest days together, but with a gentleness that felt entirely new, entirely his own. "Whatever time it takes," Nathaniel said quietly, I intend to spend it earning back every measure of trust I allowed to falter. I do not require perfection, Eliza said, a faint smile touching her lips despite the weight of the evening behind them. Only honesty, and the willingness to stand beside me the way you did tonight, even when doubt tries to creep in again. That, I can promise without hesitation, Nathaniel said. They found Lady Charlotte waiting near the entrance as they prepared to depart, her expression warm with genuine affection rather than mere curiosity. I dare say this has been the most memorable evening society has witnessed in quite some time, she said, amusement coloring her voice. You have given the entire city something far more interesting to discuss than idle gossip about your marriage's beginnings. I did not intend to provide entertainment, Eliza said, though a small laugh escaped her despite herself, the first truly light moment she had allowed herself all evening. Intended or not, my dear, you have earned every ounce of respect you now carry, Charlotte replied. I look forward to seeing what the two of you build from here. As they departed the ballroom that evening, the scandal Edmund had intended for her thoroughly reversed, and Nathaniel's genuine feelings finally spoken aloud. Eliza carried with her a fragile, cautious hope she had not allowed herself to fully embrace since the desperate night that had first bound their two lives together. Whatever awaited them beyond this evening, she resolved to face it honestly, without the careful guardedness that had protected her through so many difficult years, ready, at last, to discover whether the man she had married out of necessity might truly become someone she chose to love in return. In the weeks that followed the confrontation at Lord Pemberton's gathering, word of Edmund's disgrace spread quickly through every corner of society. Formal charges were eventually brought against him for fraud and forgery, the evidence Eliza had so carefully gathered proving more than sufficient to satisfy the magistrate's office. Edmund chose, in the end, to leave the city entirely rather than face the full weight of public trial, retreating to a distant property inherited from his mother's side of the family. His name quietly struck from the guest lists of every household that had once welcomed him. Caroline Vane suffered a similar fate, her own reputation too damaged by association to recover any meaningful standing within the circles she had once navigated with such careless cruelty. For Eliza, the resolution brought a quiet, steady relief, though it was the changes within her own household, within her marriage, that occupied far more of her thoughts in the days that followed. True to his word, Nathaniel began courting her properly, a strange and tender novelty, given the unconventional circumstances of their marriage. He began joining her each morning for breakfast, no longer absorbed silently in matters of business, but genuinely engaged in conversation, asking after her thoughts on household matters, her opinions on books she had begun reading from his extensive library, small details of her day that he had never before thought to inquire about. You do not need to change your habits so dramatically on my account, Eliza said one morning, amused by his sudden attentiveness as he set aside his newspaper entirely to listen to her account of a minor dispute among the kitchen staff that she had resolved the previous afternoon. I am not changing my habits for your sake alone, Nathaniel replied, a faint smile touching his mouth. I find, rather unexpectedly, that I genuinely wish to know these details of your life. It is not a sacrifice, Eliza. It is simply something I neglected far too long to properly appreciate. Such small moments accumulated steadily over the following weeks, each one chipping gently away at the careful guard Eliza had maintained since the painful days of Nathaniel's earlier doubt. He accompanied her on visits to Daniel's tutors, taking genuine interest in the boy's progress. He surprised her one afternoon with a small collection of gardening tools, having noticed, quite correctly, her fondness for the hours she spent tending the townhouse garden. He began, gradually, sharing more of his own history with her as well. The difficult relationship he had shared with his late father, the pressures of inheriting a dukedom far younger than he had ever anticipated, fears he had never voiced to another living soul before finding, unexpectedly, that his own wife had become someone he trusted enough to share them with. I used to believe strength meant never showing uncertainty, Nathaniel admitted one evening as they sat together in the garden, the summer air warm and fragrant around them. My father raised me to believe a duke could never afford weakness, that any admission of doubt invited disaster. I carried that belief into our marriage as well, which is precisely why I hesitated so readily when the forged evidence appeared against you. I feared, foolishly, that trusting you completely without absolute proof made me appear weak. Trust is not weakness, Eliza said gently. I learned that lesson through very different circumstances than yours, but I learned it just the same. My father, before his passing, always told me that the strongest people are not those who never doubt, but those who choose to trust regardless of uncertainty. Because the alternative, closing yourself off entirely from vulnerability, leaves you far more alone than any single mistake ever could. Nathaniel studied her carefully in the fading evening light, something deeply affectionate softening his usual composed expression. I am fortunate, then, that you were willing to teach me such a lesson, even after I gave you every reason to abandon the effort entirely. I nearly did, Eliza admitted honestly. There was a night, during the worst of it, when I packed a trunk, fully intending to leave before morning. Nathaniel's expression shifted to genuine surprise, followed quickly by quiet regret. I did not know that. I did not tell you, Eliza said. It felt easier to keep that particular weakness to myself. But I stayed, in the end, because leaving would have meant allowing Edmund's scheme to succeed entirely, and because some part of me, even then, already suspected there was something within this marriage worth fighting to protect. I am deeply grateful you stayed, Nathaniel said quietly, reaching for her hand across the small distance between their garden chairs. I do not believe I fully understood how much this household, how much my own life, had come to depend upon your presence, until the possibility of losing you became real. The tender honesty of the moment settled comfortably between them, neither rushing to fill the silence that followed, content simply to sit together beneath the darkening evening sky. The careful distance that had once defined their arrangement now replaced almost entirely by genuine, unforced closeness. Not every difficulty vanished entirely with Edmund's disgrace. A handful of stubborn voices within society continued to whisper occasional doubts about Eliza's origins, unwilling to fully abandon old prejudices despite the overwhelming evidence of her character. At a smaller gathering hosted by a distant relation of Nathaniel's, one elderly matron, Lady Fenwick, made a pointed remark within earshot of several guests about how unusual it remained to see a former servant received so warmly among the nobility. Eliza, who had grown considerably more confident in such moments since the confrontation with Edmund, addressed the comment directly, rather than allowing it to fester unspoken. I have found, Lady Fenwick, that the circumstances of one's birth matter far less than the choices one makes afterward. I chose honesty when deception might have been easier. I chose loyalty when abandonment might have spared me difficulty. I believe those choices matter a great deal more than the household in which I once carried coal. Lady Fenwick, clearly unaccustomed to such direct, composed responses, offered only a stiff nod before excusing herself from the conversation entirely. Nathaniel, standing nearby, caught Eliza's eye with unmistakable pride, no longer needing to intervene on her behalf, confident entirely in her ability to navigate such moments with grace and quiet strength. You no longer need me standing guard beside you at every gathering, he observed later that evening, as their carriage carried them home. I never truly needed it, Eliza said gently, though I confess I have always appreciated knowing you stood ready regardless. Such small tests continued periodically throughout the following weeks. Each one met with the same steady composure that had defined Eliza's character since her very first days within the household. Gradually, even the most stubborn skeptics found themselves won over, not through grand gestures but through the simple, consistent evidence of her genuine goodness and quiet intelligence, qualities that ultimately mattered far more than the humble circumstances of her birth. Meanwhile, Daniel's presence within the household continued to bring unexpected joy to both Eliza and Nathaniel. The boy had taken a particular interest in horses, spending increasing hours in the stables under the patient guidance of the head groom, and Nathaniel, noticing the boy's genuine enthusiasm, arranged for proper riding lessons as a surprise. You spoil him, Eliza said one afternoon, watching from the garden as Daniel practiced careful circuits around the paddock under close supervision. He deserves a childhood filled with opportunity, after everything the two of you endured before this marriage, Nathaniel replied. Besides, I find I rather enjoy watching him discover these small joys. It reminds me, in some ways, of what my own childhood might have looked like, had circumstances been different. Eliza slipped her hand into his, grateful beyond words for the quiet, generous kindness he continued extending toward her brother, a kindness that had never once wavered even during the difficult weeks of doubt and scandal that had tested their marriage so severely. It was several weeks later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, that Nathaniel arranged a small, private gathering in the garden, inviting only Daniel, Mrs. Whitfield, and Lady Charlotte, whose friendship with Eliza had deepened considerably since the events of Lord Pemberton's gathering. Eliza, unaware of any particular significance to the occasion, dressed simply for what she believed would be an ordinary family afternoon. She found Nathaniel waiting for her in the garden, standing near the same bench where they had shared their very first genuine conversation months earlier, back when their marriage had still felt like nothing more than an uneasy arrangement between strangers. You look nervous, Eliza observed, studying his uncharacteristically fidgeting hands as she approached. I have something I wish to say to you, Nathaniel said, properly, before witnesses who matter to us both, rather than simply in quiet moments between ourselves. Daniel, seated nearby with Mrs. Whitfield, watched with obvious curiosity, while Lady Charlotte offered Eliza an encouraging, knowing smile that suggested she understood exactly what was about to unfold. Nathaniel took both of Eliza's hands in his own, his earlier nervousness giving way to quiet, steady sincerity. Eliza, our marriage began as a desperate bargain, born from circumstances neither of us chose freely. I married you to save my family's legacy, and you married me to protect your brother's future. Neither of us expected, in that hurried, uncertain ceremony, that we would find within each other something far more valuable than either of our original intentions ever anticipated. Eliza's breath caught, warmth spreading through her chest as she listened, uncertain yet of exactly where his words intended to lead, though hope stirred readily beneath her composed exterior. You have proven yourself time and again to be the strongest, most honest, most genuinely good person I have ever had the privilege of knowing, Nathaniel continued. You faced humiliation with dignity, doubt with patience, and betrayal with a quiet strength I still find myself in awe of. I did not marry you for love, Eliza, but I have come, with absolute certainty, to love you fully and completely, and I wish, more than anything, for you to know that this marriage, whatever its beginnings, has become the truest, most valuable partnership of my entire life. Tears gathered in Eliza's eyes, though she did not attempt to hide them, allowing herself, at last, to fully embrace the fragile hope she had guarded so carefully since their earliest days together. I did not expect to find love within a bargain struck out of desperation, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I expected, at best, a comfortable arrangement, a safe home for my brother, and perhaps eventually, a cordial friendship between us. I never imagined I would come to love you as completely as I do now, Nathaniel, but I do, truly, and without reservation. Nathaniel's expression broke into a genuine, unguarded smile, relief and joy visible in equal measure as he drew her gently closer. Then let us begin again properly, he said softly, not as two strangers bound by necessity, but as two people who have chosen, freely and completely, to build a life together. Their small gathering erupted into quiet celebration, Daniel rushing forward to embrace his sister with the unrestrained enthusiasm only a child could offer, Mrs. Whitfield dabbing at her own eyes with visible emotion, Lady Charlotte offering warm congratulations tinged with the satisfaction of having witnessed the entire journey from scandal to genuine happiness. I believe, Lady Charlotte said, raising a glass of lemonade someone had thoughtfully provided for the occasion, that this deserves a proper toast. To Nathaniel and Eliza, who proved that even the most unlikely beginnings can grow into the truest kind of happiness, provided both parties possess the courage to see it through. Hear, hear, Mrs. Whitfield added, her voice thick with emotion, as she raised her own glass alongside the others. Daniel, not quite understanding the full weight of the moment, but eager to participate regardless, lifted his own cup of lemonade with solemn enthusiasm. To Eliza and Nathaniel, he declared proudly, earning a round of gentle, affectionate laughter from the assembled group. Nathaniel pulled Eliza close as the small celebration continued around them, the golden afternoon light filtering warmly through the garden trees. I believe this is precisely the life I want, he murmured quietly, meant only for her ears. Not the grand, formal existence I once believed a duke was required to lead, but this, exactly this, surrounded by people who matter, built on honesty rather than obligation. Then we are fortunate, Eliza replied softly. That desperation led us, however unexpectedly, to precisely this outcome. In the days that followed, word of Nathaniel's public devotion to his wife spread quickly through society, transforming the narrative surrounding their unusual marriage entirely. What had once been dismissed as a scandalous, desperate arrangement between a duke and a maid became, instead, a celebrated story of unexpected love overcoming every obstacle placed before it, circulated with genuine admiration rather than judgment throughout every fashionable drawing room in the city. Eliza continued managing the household with the same quiet competence she had demonstrated from her very first days as Duchess, though the atmosphere surrounding her had shifted entirely, the staff who once regarded her with uncertain formality, now working alongside her with genuine warmth and respect, recognizing in her both their former colleague and their rightful mistress, a rare and welcome combination within such households. Daniel flourished under the stability and opportunity his sister's marriage had secured for him, his tutors reporting steady progress, his early uncertainty replaced by genuine confidence as he settled fully into his new life. Nathaniel took particular interest in the boy's education, often joining his lessons personally when time allowed, determined that Daniel would grow into a young man equipped for whatever future he chose to pursue. One quiet evening, several months after their garden declaration, Eliza and Nathaniel sat together in the same library where their earliest genuine conversations had first taken root, the fire crackling softly between them exactly as it had on that first restless night when Eliza had wandered downstairs unable to sleep. "Do you remember this room?" Eliza asked, glancing around at the familiar shelves and comfortable chairs. "Vividly," Nathaniel said. "This is where I first began to suspect that the woman I had married out of desperation might prove to be far more remarkable than I ever anticipated." "And now?" Eliza asked, a teasing smile touching her lips. "Now," Nathaniel said, reaching for her hand with the easy familiarity of a man completely secure in his affection, "I know with absolute certainty that marrying you was the finest decision I have ever made, desperate circumstances or not. You did not simply save this household from ruin, Eliza. You became its greatest strength, and mine as well." Eliza leaned against him contentedly, the fire warm before them. The quiet security of genuine love settled comfortably around them both. Whatever uncertainty had once defined their unusual beginning, it had long since given way to something steady and true, a partnership built not merely on necessity, but on the deep, hard-won respect and affection two people discover only when they choose, deliberately and completely, to trust each other fully, regardless of how difficult that journey may prove along the way. Later, as the fire began to burn low and the household settled quietly into evening stillness, Eliza thought back over everything that had led her to this moment: the desperate midnight bargain, the uncertain early days of cold formality, the painful weeks of doubt, the public triumph over Edmund's cruelty, and finally, this steady, hard-won happiness she now held so carefully in her hands. None of it had followed any path she might have imagined for herself, and yet she found she would not trade a single difficult moment, for each one had shaped the strength and understanding that now anchored her marriage so firmly. "What are you thinking of?" Nathaniel asked, noticing her thoughtful silence. "Everything that brought us here," Eliza said. "How strange it is that a night of such desperation could lead to something this good." "Perhaps that is simply how the truest things arrive," Nathaniel said quietly. "Not through careful planning, but through the courage to trust each other when circumstances leave little other choice, and the willingness to keep choosing that trust, again and again, long after the original desperation has passed." Eliza rested her head against his shoulder, the quiet contentment of the moment settling deeply within her. Whatever challenges the future still held, she no longer faced them with the guarded uncertainty of a stranger thrust suddenly into an unfamiliar life. She faced them now as Nathaniel's true partner, his equal in every meaningful sense, bound not by desperate necessity, but by a love neither of them had expected, yet both had come, in time, to treasure completely. Outside the townhouse windows, the city continued its familiar rhythms, unaware that within these walls, an unlikely marriage born from a single desperate night had transformed into one of the most genuine, deeply rooted partnerships society had witnessed in years, proof that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the truest, most lasting happiness of all. A sharp knock at the townhouse door interrupted an otherwise peaceful autumn morning, nearly a year after Eliza and Nathaniel had first spoken their vows in that hurried midnight ceremony. Eliza, seated in the small study reviewing household accounts out of habit rather than necessity, glanced up as Mrs. Whitfield entered with an unfamiliar visitor's card in hand. "A gentleman is asking to see you directly, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitfield said, her expression carrying a note of caution. "He claims to have known your late father." Eliza's stomach tightened at the mention of her father, memories of the debts he had left behind still carrying a faint sting, despite the security her marriage had since provided. "Send him in." The man who entered moments later was older, perhaps 60, dressed in clothing that suggested modest means rather than genuine poverty, his expression carrying the particular calculation Eliza had learned, through hard experience, to recognize as trouble. "Duchess Ashworth," the man said, offering a shallow bow. "My name is Reginald Hollis. I believe you may recall my name from certain financial arrangements your father made before his passing." Eliza studied him carefully, a distant memory surfacing slowly. "You were one of my father's creditors." "Indeed," Hollis said, settling uninvited into the chair across from her desk. "A debt that, I believe, was never fully settled before his unfortunate passing. A debt that, given your current, elevated circumstances, I believe you are now more than capable of resolving." That debt was addressed years ago, Eliza said firmly, though a flicker of uncertainty crept into her voice. I settled every obligation I was aware of before ever entering service in this household. Perhaps you settled what you were aware of, Hollis said, his tone carrying an unmistakable edge of threat beneath its polite surface. But I hold documentation suggesting a considerably larger sum remains outstanding, one your father never fully disclosed, even to you. I imagine the current Duke would find it rather embarrassing, should such details of his wife's family finances become public knowledge, particularly given the delicate nature of your marriage's beginnings. The implication landed with uncomfortable clarity. Eliza recognized immediately the shape of the threat before her, not so different from the schemes Edmund had once employed, dressed now in the guise of legitimate grievance rather than outright fabrication. Are you suggesting blackmail, Mr. Hollis? Eliza asked, her voice remaining steady despite the alarm building within her. I would never use such an unpleasant term, Hollis said smoothly. I am simply suggesting that a reasonable payment, made privately and discreetly, would spare everyone involved considerable embarrassment. Say, a sum sufficient to settle what I believe remains owed, along with modest compensation for my continued discretion regarding the matter. Eliza felt old, familiar anger rising within her, the same anger she had once felt watching her father's mounting debts threaten everything she and Daniel depended upon. Yet she was no longer the desperate young woman carrying coal through servants' corridors, uncertain of her own worth or standing. She had faced far more calculated cruelty than this, and emerged from it stronger, not weaker. I would like to see this documentation you claim to possess, Eliza said calmly. Before any conversation of payment occurs, I require proof that such a debt genuinely exists, rather than accepting your word alone. Hollis's confident expression flickered slightly, clearly having expected easier compliance. I do not carry such sensitive documents with me for casual inspection. Then I am afraid we have very little further to discuss, Eliza said, rising from her chair with quiet, deliberate authority. If genuine documentation exists, you are welcome to present it through my husband's solicitor, who will review its authenticity thoroughly. Until such proof is provided, I will not entertain further discussion of payment, discreet or otherwise. Hollis's composure cracked slightly, frustration briefly visible beneath his practiced calm. You would risk public embarrassment over a matter so easily resolved privately? I would risk nothing, Eliza said firmly, because I have done nothing requiring concealment. If you possess genuine proof of an unsettled debt, present it properly, and it will be addressed properly. If you do not, I suggest you leave this household and reconsider whatever scheme brought you to my door this morning. Recognizing that his attempt at quiet intimidation had failed entirely, Hollis rose stiffly from his chair, his earlier confidence replaced by visible irritation. You will regret dismissing this matter so carelessly, Duchess. I have regretted very little since choosing to face my difficulties honestly, rather than allowing fear to dictate my decisions, Eliza replied evenly. I do not intend to begin regretting that choice now. Hollis departed without further argument, though the unease of the encounter lingered with Eliza throughout the remainder of the day. When Nathaniel returned home that evening, she recounted the visit in full detail, unwilling to allow even the smallest secret to take root within their marriage, after everything doubt had once cost them both. You handled it exactly as it needed to be handled, Nathaniel said, pride evident in his voice as he listened to her account. Though I will have my solicitor investigate this Hollis character thoroughly, regardless of whether he returns with genuine documentation or not. Men who attempt such schemes rarely limit themselves to a single target. The investigation, conducted quietly over the following days, revealed precisely what both Eliza and Nathaniel had suspected. Reginald Hollis carried a lengthy history of similar schemes, approaching families with any connection to financial hardship or scandal, fabricating debts and threats designed to extract quiet payments from those desperate to avoid public embarrassment. Nathaniel's solicitor gathered sufficient evidence to alert the proper authorities, ensuring Hollis would face consequences for his pattern of deception, rather than simply moving on to his next unsuspecting target. I am proud of you, Nathaniel said one evening, once the matter had been fully resolved, for trusting me enough to share this immediately, rather than carrying the burden alone out of old habit. I learned, through everything Edmund put us through, that secrets only ever grow more dangerous the longer they remain hidden, Eliza said. I did not wish to repeat that particular mistake. Then we have both learned valuable lessons from this past year, Nathaniel said, drawing her close. Trust given freely, and honesty offered without hesitation, however difficult either may prove in the moment. I only hope the lessons grow easier with time, Eliza said, a faint smile touching her lips. rather than more difficult with each new test that finds its way to our door. Perhaps, Nathaniel said, though I suspect the tests matter less than how we choose to face them, and I have never once doubted, since that night in the garden, exactly how we intend to face whatever comes next. Daniel, now a year older, and considerably more confident than the uncertain boy who had first arrived at the townhouse clutching a small trunk of belongings, had grown attentive enough to notice the tension surrounding Hollis's visit, despite Eliza's careful efforts to shield him from the worst of the worry. "Is everything all right?" he asked one evening, finding his sister seated quietly in the library, a book resting unread in her lap. "Everything is fine," Eliza assured him, setting the book aside to give him her full attention. "A man came asking for money he was not owed, but Nathaniel and I handled it together." Daniel considered this for a moment, his young face thoughtful. "You always handle things together now. It was not always like that, was it? I remember you seemed sad sometimes, in the beginning." Eliza studied her brother carefully, surprised by his perceptiveness. "You noticed that?" "I notice more than you think," Daniel said, a faint, knowing smile touching his young face. "I am glad it is different now." "So am I," Eliza said, pulling him into a warm embrace. "More than you could possibly know." Nathaniel, entering the library moments later, paused in the doorway, watching the quiet affection between brother and sister with open warmth. "Am I interrupting?" "Never," Eliza said, extending her hand toward him, inviting him to join them. "This household has room enough for all of us, exactly as we are." The three of them spent the remainder of the evening together, Daniel recounting details of his recent writing lessons with growing enthusiasm, Nathaniel listening with genuine interest, occasionally offering advice from his own boyhood experience with horses. Eliza watched the easy warmth between them, grateful beyond measure for the family she had never expected to find within such an unconventional beginning. Word of Hollis's exposed scheme spread quietly through certain circles, further cementing Eliza's reputation, not merely as a duchess who had overcome humble beginnings, but as a woman of genuine integrity and quiet strength, unwilling to be intimidated by threats or manipulated by those seeking easy advantage. What had once been Edmund's carefully engineered scandal had transformed entirely into a story of resilience, and now, this final test only served to reinforce how thoroughly Eliza had grown into her role, not merely as Nathaniel's wife, but as a formidable partner in every sense. That winter, as snow began settling gently over the city, Eliza stood once more at the window of her sitting room, watching the quiet white world beyond the glass, much as she had on that very first afternoon following her hurried wedding, uncertain and overwhelmed by circumstances she had never chosen for herself. The woman who stood at that window now bore little resemblance to the frightened, uncertain bride of that earlier day, though the same quiet strength that had always defined her remained steady at her core, tested and proven through every difficulty that had followed. Nathaniel joined her at the window, wrapping a warm shawl gently around her shoulders before settling beside her, his arm finding its familiar place around her waist. "A year ago tonight," he said softly, "I stood in my study convinced I had lost everything, only hours from watching my family's legacy slip entirely beyond my control." "And now?" Eliza asked, leaning contentedly into his embrace. "Now I understand that losing that desperate gamble would have meant losing far more than an inheritance," Nathaniel said. "It would have meant never knowing you, never discovering the kind of strength and love I did not know I was capable of finding, or deserving." Eliza turned to face him fully, warmth and quiet joy filling her completely, as she considered everything the past year had brought them, the desperate bargain, the painful doubts, the public scandals, and finally, this steady, hard-won happiness neither of them had dared imagine on that first uncertain night. "I believe," she said softly, "that we found exactly what we were always meant to find, even if neither of us recognized it at the beginning." Outside, the snow continued falling quietly over the city, blanketing the streets in soft, undisturbed white, while within the warm glow of the townhouse, a duke and the maid who had become his greatest strength stood together, their partnership finally, completely secure, ready to face whatever future still awaited them, side by side, exactly as they had chosen to remain since that very first desperate night had bound their two lives together forever.